The corridors of Windsor Castle were quiet, too quiet for a place that had once echoed with the footsteps of kings and the laughter of queens. Yet in the year 1818, a shadow moved through these halls, slow, hunched, and unsteady. His clothes hung in tatters, his beard long and white, his eyes vacant. The man who passed the doors and turned corners was still called George, still called King, though the title felt like a fragile echo of another life. He did not see the portraits that lined the walls, the faces of ancestors who had shaped nations. He did not hear the soft whispers of the servants, or the faint music that drifted from the distant ballroom. The world around him existed in shapes and shadows, in sounds he could no longer recognize. Names had lost their meaning, voices were merely vibrations, distant and meaningless. At night, they said, he muttered to someone unseen. Sometimes he laughed without reason, sometimes he wept. The Queen, his devoted Charlotte, had been gone for months, yet he could not remember her name. The children who had once filled the castle with life now lived elsewhere, and even their familiar faces were strangers to him. He wandered, a ghost in the home he had ruled for 60 years. The empire that had bowed to his will, the colonies that had once called him tyrant, all seemed to belong to another man. He was here, in his body, in his castle, yet far from the world he had known, a world where a young king had dreamed of doing everything right, of being good, of being loved. And now, in this endless winter of the mind, the question lingered quietly in the corners of the empty halls: how had he come to this? How had a king, born to command, who had once held the hopes of a nation in his hands, become a shadow that no one recognized, even himself? On the 4th of June 1738, a child was born in London, and with his first cries, the hopes of a nation stirred. George Augustus Frederick was the first Hanoverian heir born on English soil in over a century, a prince whose very tongue would speak the language of the land he was destined to rule. His mother, Caroline of Ansbach, watched over him with a mixture of tenderness and strict expectation, whispering lessons into the soft darkness of his nursery. Be a good king, George. Be a king who does right, who stands for justice, who loves his people. From the earliest days, George was raised apart from the world, cocooned in formality and ritual, shielded from the rough edges of life but also isolated from its warmth. Tutors and governesses filled his days with lessons on duty and decorum, on history, philosophy, and the delicate web of politics that surrounded a throne he had not yet claimed. Yet for all the rules and protocols, there was a spark within him, a desire not for power, but for goodness. He did not crave the grandeur of courtly life or the accolades of the nobles. He wanted simply to be a king who could do right by his people, a man who could carry the heavy mantle of duty with honor. Even as a boy, he would pause by the windows of St. James's Palace, looking out over the city, imagining the streets, the markets, the lives of those he would one day serve. In his heart there was a sense that the crown was not just a symbol of authority, but a responsibility, a promise to be faithful, not only to tradition, but to conscience. And so he grew, the quiet Hanoverian boy with English words on his lips, carrying the weight of a future he had not yet lived, dreaming of a kingdom he would one day know, yet could not yet imagine. In 1760, George Augustus Frederick became King of Great Britain. He was 22, barely more than a boy in the eyes of the court, yet he carried on his shoulders the weight of an empire. The crown, heavy with centuries of expectation, did not intimidate him. Instead, it seemed to call forth something within, a sense of duty, a quiet, unwavering belief that a king must strive to do right, not merely to rule. From the beginning, George distinguished himself from his predecessors. He avoided the scandals and secret liaisons that had so often marked royal history. He sought, above all, honesty and decency, virtues that seemed almost radical in the gilded world of courtly ambition. When he married Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz in 1761, he did so with genuine affection, seeing her for the very first time on their wedding day. Their marriage was not a political arrangement, but a union of hearts, a rare and fragile bond in the life of royalty. The young king was devoted to his family. Buckingham House, which he purchased to house his growing family, became a sanctuary of warmth and laughter, a place where the future of the monarchy could grow alongside love and care. He took joy in the small moments, the cries of newborns, the quiet games with his children, the simple comfort of a family meal. 15 children would come to be born of this union, each one a testament to his desire not merely to rule, but to nurture, to protect, and to leave a legacy of goodness rather than power alone. Yet George was not naive. He knew that being king meant walking a path filled with expectation, scrutiny, and the relentless currents of politics. He read every document, listened to every counsel, and sought to temper justice with mercy. He dreamed of a monarchy that could embody morality, a crown that could symbolize not only authority but responsibility. He wanted to be loved not for his power, but for his fairness, his constancy, and his unwavering intent to do what was right. And in those early years there was hope. Hope that a king could be both strong and compassionate, that the crown could be a force for guidance and goodness, rather than fear. Hope that George III, young, earnest, and idealistic, could shape the destiny of his nation not only with decrees and policies but with his heart. But history, as it often does, has its own designs. And the storms that would test him, the loss of colonies, the rise of revolutionary tides, the fragile human body confronting the weight of disease, were already gathering on the horizon. For now, though, he was a young king with ideals, a man who believed in the possibility of doing right, and a father who dreamed of a family bound by love in a world defined by duty. The empire was vast, stretching across oceans, dotted with colonies that had once pledged loyalty to the crown. But by the 1760s, a subtle unrest was growing across the Atlantic. The American colonies, distant and fiercely independent, were beginning to demand a voice in their own affairs, resisting taxes and laws imposed from across the sea. George, still young and earnest, followed these developments with a heavy heart. He did not desire conflict, nor did he wish to impose tyranny. He only wanted order, unity, and loyalty, but history was already pulling the threads from under his hands. He relied on his ministers, trusting Parliament to manage the delicate negotiations. He wrote letters, read reports, and met with advisers, trying to balance firmness with fairness. Yet the tide of revolution could not be restrained by good intentions alone. When the colonies issued their grievances, when towns burned with anger at what they called unjust taxation, the young king felt a personal responsibility, a weight pressing on his conscience. He had inherited a crown, yes, but with it came the impossible task of reconciling loyalty with justice. In private, George wrestled with the concept of being called a tyrant in documents he would never have authored. The Declaration of Independence, written in 1776, named him explicitly as a despot, an oppressor, a man who denied liberty. To him, It was not rebellion against a person, but against the crown as an institution, yet the words pierced him. He had never sought to harm the colonists, never sought to rule with cruelty. And yet, history was already casting its judgment. The young king spent long nights in contemplation, pacing the quiet corridors of his palaces, staring out at the city lights, imagining the fires across the Atlantic. He could see the struggle, the passion, the desire for freedom, and he felt both a duty and a helplessness. This was not a war of his making, but he was the figurehead, the symbol of authority, and the weight of responsibility was crushing. He wrote letters to his ministers, urging measured responses, seeking compromise, hoping for resolution without bloodshed. But the forces at play were larger than any one man. The colony's calls for liberty, combined with the pressures of international politics, were unstoppable. George began to understand that being good and being right were not always enough. Duty demanded action, yet action could not guarantee justice. And as he considered the path forward, he felt the first whispers of a personal failure, a shadow creeping into the idealistic heart of a young king. The stage was set. The empire, vast and proud, was beginning to unravel at the edges. And George III, eager to do right, to uphold honor, to protect his people, was about to face a trial that would test not only his crown but his very mind. By 1781, the war across the Atlantic had reached its grim conclusion. The city of Yorktown fell, and with it, the fragile hope of keeping the American colonies intact. George III, once a young king filled with ideals of duty and honor, now faced a reality that no amount of devotion could change. The empire, so vast, so meticulously managed in theory, had slipped from his grasp. He sat alone in his study, quill trembling in hand, the paper before him untouched yet heavy with meaning. He began to draft a formal abdication, a private confession of defeat. The words were careful, measured, full of regret. I am responsible. I have failed. My crown cannot undo what has been lost. Yet, for reasons he could scarcely articulate, he did not send it. He could not abandon the throne entirely, even as the weight of personal failure pressed down upon him. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, formally recognizing the independence of the United States, the young king felt the sting of humiliation as deeply as any soldier on the battlefield. It was not just a political loss, but a moral one, a wound to the conscience of a man who had strived to act rightly. In the eyes of the world, he was a defeated monarch. In his own eyes, he was a man who had let down not just a nation, but the very principles he had promised to uphold. And yet George carried on. He continued to attend councils, to preside over ceremonies, to greet foreign dignitaries with the composure expected of a king. He smiled when necessary, spoke words of encouragement, maintained appearances. But beneath the surface, the seeds of doubt and self-reproach had taken root. Every letter from Parliament, every report of unrest in other colonies, every whisper of discontent at court seemed to echo the same refrain: he had failed, and there was no undoing it. The loss of America was more than political, it was deeply personal. He had sought to protect his people, to uphold the unity of the kingdom, to honor his responsibilities. And yet, despite all his care, the empire had moved beyond his reach, leaving him standing on the edge of history, aware that ideals and duty could not always prevail against the inexorable tide of events. In the quiet hours, George would sometimes linger by the window, looking out over the Thames, imagining the distant shores where the flags of independence now flew. The king who had once dreamed of being just, of being a moral compass for his realm, now confronted the harsh reality that even the noblest intentions could not bend history to a man's will. And in that silence, he began to understand that some losses could not be measured in treaties or territories. They were etched deep into the heart, invisible, relentless, and permanent. Long before the world would speak of madness, before physicians debated diagnoses and historians searched for explanations, there had been a moment, small, almost unnoticed, when something first shifted. It was the year 1765. George was still a relatively young king, still surrounded by the rhythm of governance and the comfort of family life. His children were growing, his court was orderly, and the machinery of the kingdom moved forward day by day with reassuring regularity. And then, quite suddenly, the king fell ill. At first it seemed like an ordinary sickness. There was fever, exhaustion, a restlessness that would not allow him to sleep. His servants noticed that he paced the rooms long after midnight, muttering fragments of thought as though arguing with someone who was not there. Letters went unfinished. Documents remained unopened on his desk. The physicians were summoned, their wigs powdered, their faces solemn with professional certainty. They spoke of nerves, of temporary agitation, of the pressures of kingship upon a mind too diligent for its own good. Such things, they assured the court, were not uncommon among men burdened with great responsibility. George himself seemed aware that something within him had become unsettled. Those close to him noticed moments when his thoughts raced faster than his words could contain. He spoke quickly, urgently, moving from subject to subject with an intensity that left his listeners struggling to keep pace. Then, just as suddenly, he would fall quiet, staring into space as if listening to a distant voice. Yet the episode passed. Within weeks the king appeared to recover. His sleep returned, his speech slowed, and the familiar steadiness of his personality reasserted itself. The court breathed a collective sigh of relief. The physicians congratulated themselves on their treatment, though the remedies had been little more than rest, diet, and patience. Life resumed its rhythm. George returned to his duties with renewed determination, perhaps even with a deeper seriousness than before. He read his papers carefully, consulted his ministers, and spent evenings with his growing family. To most observers, the illness soon became little more than a brief inconvenience, a footnote in the long life of a busy monarch. But somewhere beneath the calm surface of his mind, something had changed. Like the faint tremor that precedes an earthquake, the first disturbance had already passed through him. No one yet understood its meaning, not the doctors, not the courtiers, not even the king himself. Years would pass before the true storm arrived. And when it did, it would not resemble a simple illness. It would come like a tide that could not be stopped, sweeping through the mind of a man who had once believed that discipline and duty could master anything. For now, however, George III continued to rule. The empire still stretched across continents. His family still filled the palace with life. His people still saw him as a steady, moral king. And the darkness that had briefly touched his mind slipped quietly back into the shadows, waiting. More than 20 years passed after that first strange illness. For a long time, George III appeared steady again, diligent, disciplined, deeply committed to the responsibilities of kingship. He worked tirelessly, often longer than his ministers expected. Papers were read carefully, decisions weighed with patience, and the king maintained the image he had always valued, that of a conscientious ruler devoted to duty. But in the summer of 1788, something changed. At first the signs were subtle. The king complained of sleepless nights, of a strange agitation he could not quite explain. Servants noticed that he walked the corridors long after midnight, his footsteps echoing through the quiet halls of Windsor and Kew. His speech grew quicker, his thoughts racing ahead of themselves as though some unseen engine had begun turning too fast. Soon the changes became impossible to ignore. George began talking for hours without pause. Ministers would enter the room expecting a short audience, only to find themselves listening helplessly as the king spoke in long, breathless streams of words, ideas tumbling over one another, thoughts leaping unpredictably from theology to farming, from politics to philosophy. Sometimes his sentences made perfect sense. Other times they wandered into strange territory, as though his mind had lost the steady path it once followed. Those closest to him began to worry. Then the behavior grew stranger still. One afternoon in the palace gardens, the king stopped before a large oak tree and greeted it with formal courtesy, extending his hand as though addressing a visiting monarch. Courtiers watched in uneasy silence as he spoke politely to the branches, convinced he was conversing with the King of Prussia. On another occasion, he reportedly attempted to bury a piece of beef in the garden soil, explaining with complete seriousness that he wished to see whether a meat tree might grow from it. The court tried to explain these moments away, whispering that the king was merely tired, that the burdens of rule had finally demanded rest. But the truth was becoming impossible to hide. George's speech grew louder, faster, unstoppable. He sometimes talked for 10 hours at a stretch. His voice became hoarse, yet he continued speaking as though silence itself were unbearable. At times he laughed loudly without cause, at others he grew irritable, suspicious, even frightened. By autumn, the situation had become alarming. Physicians were called again and again. Their treatments, purges, medicines, bleeding, did nothing to calm the storm inside his mind. The king, who had once valued dignity above all else, now moved unpredictably through the palace, sometimes affectionate, sometimes agitated, sometimes lost in thoughts no one else could follow. Eventually the doctors made a decision that horrified many at court. To prevent him from injuring himself or others, the king would have to be restrained. A man who ruled a vast empire, who commanded armies and governed millions, was now fastened into a chair, his wrists bound by straps meant to protect him from his own restless body. At times a cloth was placed in his mouth to stop the torrent of words that seemed impossible to silence. Behind closed doors, the monarchy faced a terrifying question. What happens when the king himself loses control of his mind? Parliament began to whisper about regency. Ministers debated what should be done if the sovereign could no longer rule. The queen watched helplessly as the man she loved, her husband of nearly 30 years, slipped further into a world she could not reach. And somewhere within the chaos of sleepless nights, endless speech, and frightened physicians, George III drifted farther from the steady mind that had once defined him. The storm had arrived. And it was only beginning. As the king's condition worsened through the autumn of 1788, fear began to spread quietly through the corridors of power. The problem was no longer merely medical, it was constitutional, political, and deeply personal. A king who could not govern threatened the delicate balance of the entire kingdom. Physicians came and went, each offering confident theories and equally uncertain remedies. They spoke of nerves, of inflammation, of exhaustion brought on by too much study and responsibility. Yet none of their treatments seemed to quiet the restless storm within George's mind. At times he was restless and agitated, pacing rooms endlessly. At other moments he spoke with such relentless energy that those around him felt exhausted simply listening. Hours would pass, yet the king continued talking, his voice hoarse, his thoughts racing forward without pause, as though silence itself had become impossible. Queen Charlotte watched this decline with growing despair. For nearly 3 decades their marriage had been one of rare loyalty and affection. She had seen him patient with their children, devoted to family life, committed to the quiet routines that gave structure to the burdens of rule. To witness him now, distressed, confused, and increasingly beyond the reach of reason, was almost unbearable. Desperate for help, she turned to an unusual figure. His name was Dr. Francis Willis, a country physician who ran a private institution for the treatment of the mentally ill. Unlike many fashionable doctors of London society, Willis believed madness could be treated not simply with medicines, but with strict discipline and careful management of behavior. When Willis arrived at court, he found a king surrounded by anxious doctors, worried ministers, and a household paralyzed by uncertainty. His approach was simple, though severe. To Willis, the king was not beyond recovery. But he believed the mind, when disordered, must be brought back into balance through firm authority. Excitement had to be restrained. Excess energy had to be contained. Calm behavior would be rewarded, agitation would be corrected. And so the treatment began. When George became violent or uncontrollably talkative, attendants placed him in a restraining jacket to prevent him from harming himself. At times he was confined to a chair, watched constantly by guards who ensured he could not wander the palace or injure himself in confusion. Yet Willis also believed in encouragement. When the king behaved calmly, when his speech slowed, when he listened instead of speaking endlessly, he was allowed small privileges. Meals were served with proper utensils. Short visits with family were permitted. The routines of ordinary life were gradually reintroduced, as though rebuilding the structure of the mind piece by piece. To modern eyes, these methods seem harsh, even cruel. But within the world of 18th-century medicine, they were considered progressive. Many believed madness was caused by excess stimulation of the mind, and that firm control could gradually restore order. For Queen Charlotte and the ministers watching anxiously from the sidelines, Willis represented hope. The king was no longer simply ill, he was undergoing treatment. Yet even as the new doctor imposed discipline upon the chaotic world inside George's mind, the methods themselves carried a heavy cost. The restraints, the isolation, the constant supervision, all of it slowly stripped away the dignity of a man who had once ruled one of the largest empires on earth. And the question lingered quietly in every room of the palace. Was the king recovering? Or merely being subdued? The answer would only become clear in the months that followed, as the strange and painful experiment of treating a mad king continued behind the closed doors of the royal household. The treatment of King George continued through the long, uncertain winter of 1788 and into the early months of the following year. Within the walls of the royal residence, a strange and unsettling routine began to take shape, one governed not by the dignity of kingship, but by the strict discipline of medical authority. Dr. Francis Willis believed that madness was a form of disorder that could be forced back into balance. To him, the mind was like a restless animal that needed firm handling. If excitement could be suppressed, if agitation could be controlled, then reason might slowly return. And so the king was subjected to the full range of 18th-century medicine. His physicians attempted to draw the illness out of his body through purges and violent emetics. He was given medicines meant to provoke vomiting, as though the madness itself might be expelled like poison. At other times he was forced to drink bitter mixtures that left him weak and trembling. Bleeding was also employed, one of the most common medical practices of the age. Doctors believed that by removing blood, they could restore balance within the body's humors. For George, this meant sitting quietly while physicians opened a vein, watching the dark red flow into waiting bowls. Then there were the blistering treatments. Powders containing arsenic were applied to the skin to create painful blisters, based on the belief that illness could be drawn outward through the surface of the body. The king's skin sometimes erupted in sores and swelling, leaving him exhausted and uncomfortable for days. Cold baths were used as well. Without warning, attendants might lower him into icy water in an attempt to shock the body into calmness. The sudden cold would steal his breath, leaving him gasping while the physicians observed carefully, convinced they were helping restore order to a troubled mind. Food was sometimes restricted, as many doctors believed excessive eating might fuel the agitation of madness. Hunger, they argued, would quiet the restless body and encourage restraint. To modern observers, these methods seemed brutal. But in the late 18th century they were considered advanced medicine, practiced by serious men who believed they were doing everything possible to help their patient. And yet, perhaps the most astonishing part of this story is not the harshness of the treatments, but the resilience of the man enduring them. Through restraint, blistering, purging, and endless observation, George III survived. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the storm within his mind began to weaken. The endless torrent of speech began to slow. His thoughts, once racing uncontrollably, started to gather themselves into something closer to order. There were moments, brief but unmistakable, when the king looked at those around him with recognition. Moments when his voice became calmer. Moments when the old George, the careful reader of documents, the thoughtful ruler, the devoted husband and father, seemed to flicker faintly back into existence. The court watched these small changes with cautious hope. Could the impossible be happening? Could a king who had been lost in madness find his way back? By the early months of 1789, the answer was beginning to reveal itself. The man who had been restrained, bled, blistered, and exhausted by months of treatment was slowly returning to himself. And when the moment of recovery finally arrived, it would surprise almost everyone, including the king himself. By the spring of 1789, something remarkable began to happen. After months of chaos, sleepless nights, and painful treatments, the storm inside George's mind slowly began to quiet. The endless talking faded. The agitation softened. Where there had once been confusion and restless energy, there were now pauses, moments of calm thought that grew longer with each passing day. At first, those around him barely dared to believe it. The attendants who had watched him day and night noticed that the king was beginning to listen again. When spoken to, he sometimes responded with measured answers instead of torrents of words. His eyes seemed more focused. His movements became less erratic. Dr. Willis observed carefully, cautious not to celebrate too soon. Recovery from madness, he believed, must be gradual and disciplined. Privileges were restored slowly. The king was allowed to eat with proper utensils again. The restraints were used less frequently. Conversations grew longer and more coherent. Then came a moment that many at court would later remember with quiet amazement. The king asked to see Queen Charlotte. For months she had been kept away from him, partly for her own emotional protection and partly because physicians feared her presence might excite him too much. Now, however, Willis believed the meeting might be possible. When the Queen entered the room, the atmosphere was heavy with uncertainty. George looked at her, and he recognized her. It was a simple thing, one person recognizing another, but within the walls of the palace it felt almost miraculous. The woman who had watched helplessly as her husband disappeared into madness now saw a familiar expression return to his face. Slowly, gently, the king resumed small pieces of his former life. He began reading again, though at first only short passages. He spoke with ministers about minor matters of governance. His speech regained its calm rhythm, his thoughts once again moving in careful, deliberate patterns. News of the recovery spread quickly through London. The city erupted in celebration. Crowds gathered in the streets, lighting bonfires and cheering late into the night. Bells rang from church towers. Taverns overflowed with people raising glasses to the health of their restored king. For many Britons, George had never been a distant or mysterious ruler. He was seen as a moral monarch, a man devoted to family and duty. His illness had frightened the nation not just politically, but emotionally. And now his recovery felt like the return of something deeply familiar. When he appeared again in public, the reaction was overwhelming. People cheered, waved hats, and shouted blessings as the royal carriage passed through the streets. The king who had once been blamed for losing America now found himself embraced with renewed affection. It was as if the nation had watched him walk to the very edge of darkness, and return. Dr. Willis, once an obscure country doctor, became a celebrated figure. Parliament granted him a lifetime pension for saving the king. His methods, once questioned, were now praised as visionary. And for a time, it seemed as though the worst had passed. George returned to his work with renewed dedication. He read documents, met ministers, and resumed the endless routine of governance. The experience had changed him, made him perhaps more cautious, more aware of the fragility of the human mind, but he appeared steady once more. Yet beneath the calm surface, something remained uncertain. No one knew why the illness had come, and no one knew whether it might return. For the moment, however, the king was well. The empire continued to move forward. His family remained around him. The palace corridors were once again filled with ordinary life rather than anxious whispers. But the shadow that had once touched his mind had not truly vanished. It had only retreated, waiting for another moment to emerge. For a time, life seemed to settle again into a familiar rhythm. After the crisis of 1788, and the remarkable recovery that followed, George returned to his duties with renewed seriousness. The experience had shaken him, but it had not broken his sense of responsibility. If anything, he worked harder than before, as though determined to prove, to himself as much as to the nation, that he remained capable of ruling. His days followed a careful routine. Papers arrived each morning, stacked neatly on his desk. Ministers came and went, presenting reports, proposals, and questions that required the king's approval. George read everything with patient attention. He was known for his diligence, sometimes frustrating his advisors by examining documents line by line rather than accepting easy summaries. But while his mind appeared steady, his body was slowly beginning to betray him. The first change came quietly. His vision, once sharp enough to read dense reports late into the evening, began to blur. Letters on the page seemed to soften at the edges, lines merging into shadows. At first he dismissed it as fatigue, perhaps too many hours spent reading by candlelight. Yet the problem worsened. Physicians eventually spoke the word that hung uneasily in the air: cataracts. The clouding of the eyes progressed slowly but relentlessly. George found himself relying more often on others to read documents aloud. Trusted secretaries now sat beside him, carefully reciting the contents of letters, reports, and parliamentary acts. The king listened intently. Despite his failing eyesight, he refused to abandon his responsibilities. Decisions still had to be made. Laws still required royal assent. The machinery of government continued turning, and George remained determined to guide it. But the loss of vision brought with it a deeper fear. For a man who valued duty above all else, dependence was unsettling. When documents were read aloud instead of read personally, the king worried constantly about deception. What if someone altered the words? What if a clause were hidden in the text, a phrase slipped into a document that violated his conscience? He was particularly concerned about matters involving the Church of England. As king, he had sworn to protect the Church and its authority. The thought that he might unknowingly sign a document weakening that promise troubled him deeply. Sometimes he asked that the same paper be read aloud several times. Not because he doubted his ministers entirely, but because he feared the possibility of error, or worse, manipulation. Meanwhile, other changes were quietly unfolding. His hearing began to fade. Conversations that once flowed easily now required careful attention. Voices seemed more distant, sometimes muffled, forcing him to lean closer or ask for words to be repeated. Still, George persisted. He walked the palace gardens when he could, listening to the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, trying to maintain the calm habits that had always steadied his mind. Music remained a comfort. Occasionally he would sit at the keyboard of a pianoforte, his fingers moving slowly across familiar melodies learned long ago. For those who watched him closely, these years carried a strange mixture of strength and fragility. The king who had once descended into madness had returned to rule again, but age, illness, and exhaustion were slowly gathering around him. Europe itself was changing rapidly. Across the Channel, revolution had erupted in France. Thrones trembled, kings were overthrown, and the old order of Europe seemed suddenly uncertain. War loomed again, this time on a scale far larger than the American conflict that had once wounded George so deeply. The world outside Britain was becoming louder, more dangerous, more unpredictable. And inside the palace, the king, older now, slower, struggling with fading sight and hearing, continued to work carefully through his papers, determined to fulfill his duties as long as he possibly could. But the fragile balance within his mind had not disappeared. The storm that had once overtaken him was still part of his story. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the quiet stability of these years was beginning to give way to another turning point, one that would not come from politics or war, but from something far more personal. From loss. a loss that would reach deeper into George's heart than any defeat on the battlefield ever had. Among all the burdens that had marked George's long life, war, political turmoil, the strain of illness, there remained one quiet refuge that had always brought him comfort: his children. 15 of them had been born to him and Queen Charlotte over the years. The palace had once been full of their voices, their lessons, their music echoing through the halls. Yet as time passed, many of those relationships grew strained. Some of his sons became sources of disappointment, living extravagantly, quarreling with their father, entangled in debts and scandals that troubled the king deeply. But one child remained different: Princess Amelia. She was the youngest of George's daughters, gentle in temperament, and deeply devoted to her father. As the king grew older and his health became more fragile, Amelia often became a quiet source of comfort to him. She spoke with him softly, read to him when his eyesight faltered, and sat beside him during long evenings when the responsibilities of rule weighed heavily on his mind. To George, she represented something rare and precious: simple affection without political tension, without disappointment. But in 1810, Amelia fell gravely ill. At first there was hope that she might recover. Physicians attended her constantly, offering treatments and reassurances that illness could still be overcome. Yet as the weeks passed, it became clear that her condition was worsening. The king was devastated. He had already endured the slow erosion of his senses, his sight dimming, his hearing fading, but the thought of losing Amelia struck at something far deeper. He asked for news of her constantly. Messengers moved back and forth between rooms, bringing small updates that the king clung to desperately. Finally, the inevitable news arrived. Princess Amelia died on the 2nd of November 1810. She was only 27 years old. When the king learned of her death, those around him saw something shift within him, something fragile that had been holding together for many years. He wept openly. For a man who had spent decades carrying the burdens of monarchy with quiet restraint, the grief was overwhelming. Amelia had been more than a daughter. She had been a companion, a comfort, a reminder that love could exist beyond the rigid expectations of the crown. And now she was gone. In the days that followed, George began to withdraw into himself. The careful discipline he had maintained for years began to unravel. His speech once again became restless and disordered. Sleep abandoned him. His thoughts wandered through memories and fragments of grief that refused to settle. Physicians were called again, but the familiar pattern was already returning. The king who had fought so long to maintain control over his mind was slipping back into darkness. This time, however, the illness did not come as a sudden storm. It came slowly, like a curtain lowering across his world, quietly, relentlessly, without mercy. Within months, it became clear that the mind which had once recovered so miraculously in 1789 was no longer returning. The loss of Amelia had opened a wound too deep for the king to bear. And as his grief consumed him, Parliament began to confront a difficult reality. The monarch who had ruled Britain for half a century could no longer govern. The crown still rested on his head. But the power of the kingdom was about to pass into someone else's hands. As the winter of 1810 turned into the early months of 1811, it became impossible for the government to ignore what everyone inside the palace already understood. The king was no longer capable of ruling. George's mind had retreated into a place beyond the reach of reason. Conversations drifted into confusion. Days passed in restless wandering, interrupted by sudden outbursts of speech or long silences that seemed almost empty of thought. The careful discipline that had once allowed him to return from illness decades earlier had disappeared. This time, there was no recovery. Ministers gathered in Parliament to debate what must be done. The situation was delicate, almost unprecedented. Britain still had a king, but the king could not govern. The machinery of the state, laws, war decisions, diplomacy, could not simply pause while the monarch suffered. The solution was one that had been whispered about during his earlier illness, but never fully enacted. A regency. Under the Regency Act of 1811, the king's eldest son, the Prince of Wales, would rule in his father's place as Prince Regent. Officially, George III remained the monarch of Britain. His name still appeared on documents. His authority still formed the legal foundation of government. But in reality, power had passed to his son. The relationship between father and son had long been troubled. The Prince of Wales, who would later become George IV, was everything his father disliked. Where the king had valued discipline and modest living, the prince embraced extravagance and luxury. He accumulated enormous debts, hosted lavish parties, and surrounded himself with fashionable society figures rather than serious ministers. To the older king, who had always believed a monarch should embody moral restraint, his son's lifestyle represented a painful disappointment. Yet now it was this very son who held the reins of power. Inside Windsor Castle, however, these political changes meant very little. The king lived in a world that had grown strangely distant. His rooms were quiet, his routines carefully controlled by attendants and physicians. Windows were often kept shaded. Visitors were limited. The once powerful ruler who had presided over wars, treaties, and parliaments now moved slowly through familiar halls without understanding the events unfolding beyond them. Occasionally he spoke aloud as though addressing people who were no longer there. At other times he quoted long passages from the Bible, the words flowing from memory even when other thoughts seemed to vanish. Music sometimes reached him in ways ordinary conversation could not. On rare evenings he would sit at the pianoforte and play simple melodies, his fingers moving automatically across the keys as though guided by echoes from a former life. But most of the time, the king lived in a quiet fog of memory and confusion. Beyond the castle walls, Britain entered what would later be known as the Regency era, a period of cultural change, political tension, and continuing war against Napoleon. The Prince Regent presided over glittering balls and fashionable society, shaping the tone of an entirely new age. Meanwhile, the man who was still legally king drifted farther away from the world he had ruled for so long. Years began to pass. 10 of them, in fact. 10 long years during which George III remained alive, yet increasingly distant from reality. A monarch who had lost not only his power, but slowly, almost completely, himself. And within the quiet rooms of Windsor Castle, the transformation became impossible to ignore. The king was becoming something like a ghost within his own life. The years that followed were quiet in a way that Windsor Castle had never known before. Once, these halls had been filled with ministers arriving for audiences, courtiers carrying letters, musicians playing in candlelit rooms. Now much of that life had moved elsewhere. The center of power had shifted to London, where the Prince Regent presided over government and society. Windsor remained, but it had become something else, almost a sanctuary, almost a prison. Within its walls lived a man who had once ruled an empire. George III was now an old man, and the changes in his body were as severe as those in his mind. His sight had faded completely. Cataracts had taken the last fragments of vision he possessed, leaving him in permanent darkness. His hearing had nearly vanished as well. Voices often reached him only as distant vibrations. And so he moved slowly through a world he could neither see nor properly hear. Servants guided him through the corridors of the castle, their arms steadying his steps as he walked. His beard, once carefully trimmed, had grown long and white. The king who had once dressed with the strict dignity of royal life now wore simpler clothing, often loosely arranged, the details no longer important in a world without sight. To visitors, few were allowed to see him. The transformation was startling. This was the same man who had presided over court ceremonies, who had read endless documents, who had once stood before cheering crowds in London. Yet now he seemed distant, as though the thread connecting him to the world had been quietly cut. Most days passed in near silence. Sometimes he wandered the rooms of Windsor, guided by memory rather than vision. Familiar spaces, the chapel, the corridors, the gardens beyond the windows, existed only in fragments of recollection. He occasionally spoke aloud to people who were not present, conversations drifting between memory and imagination. Yet there were moments, strange, fleeting moments, when something of the old king seemed to return. Music was one of them. Even without sight, even with hearing greatly diminished, George sometimes sat before a pianoforte and played. The melodies were simple hymns or familiar tunes from earlier years, and his fingers seemed to remember what his mind could not fully grasp. Those who listened said the music had a quiet sadness to it, as though echoing through a long corridor of forgotten time. The Bible was another thread that remained. He could still recite long passages from memory, verses learned decades earlier when his mind had been strong and disciplined. Sometimes he spoke them softly into the empty room, the words flowing steadily, the rhythms of Scripture anchoring him to something stable when everything else had become uncertain. But most of the time, the king lived in a kind of twilight. He did not know that Napoleon had risen and fallen. He did not know that Europe had been reshaped by war. He did not know that his own son ruled the kingdom in his place. The empire moved forward without him. Outside Windsor's walls, the world was changing rapidly. Inside the castle, time moved slowly, gently, almost mercifully. Years passed in this quiet state. And then, in 1818, another loss arrived, one that would have shattered his heart if he had still been able to remember it. The woman who had shared his life for nearly 60 years was about to die. Queen Charlotte, his partner through youth, through war, through madness and recovery, was reaching the end of her own long journey. And when the news of her death finally reached the king, it would reveal just how far away his mind had already traveled. In November of 1818, Windsor Castle fell into a deep and solemn silence. Queen Charlotte, who had shared George's life for nearly 57 years, was dying. She had been there from the very beginning, arriving in England as a young German princess who had never seen her husband before their wedding day. Over the decades that followed, she had stood beside him through everything: the early optimism of his reign, the political storms of war, the terrifying years of illness, and the fragile recovery that once seemed almost miraculous. Together they had built a family that filled the palace with life. 15 children had been born of their marriage, And though not all those relationships remained harmonious, Charlotte had always remained the steady center of the royal household. But time had slowly taken its toll. By the late 1810s, the Queen herself was frail. Age had weakened her body, and the long years of emotional strain had left their mark. She spent much of her time resting, surrounded by attendants and family members who knew the end was approaching. On the 17th of November 1818, Queen Charlotte died. The palace mourned quietly. For the courtiers and servants who had watched the royal couple for decades, her passing felt like the closing of an era. She had been the constant presence beside the king, the one who had worried for him during his illness, who had endured the terrifying months when his mind seemed lost to madness. But there was one person whose reaction mattered more than anyone else's. George. The news was carried carefully to his rooms. Those responsible for telling him approached with hesitation, uncertain how he might respond. In earlier years, the loss of someone so dear would have shattered him. The death of Princess Amelia had already proven how deeply he could grieve. Yet the king who sat in Windsor Castle in 1818 was no longer the same man. When they told him that Charlotte had died, he listened quietly. There was no visible recognition, no sudden grief, no questions. The woman who had shared his life for more than half a century, the mother of his children, the companion who had watched over him through illness and recovery, had vanished from his memory. It was as though she had never existed. For those standing in the room, the moment was heartbreaking in a way that words could scarcely describe. The tragedy was not merely that the king had lost his wife. It was that his mind had already erased her long before death could take her away. The great love story of their long marriage ended not with a dramatic farewell, but with silence. After Charlotte's death, the castle grew even quieter. George continued his slow routines, walking the familiar corridors with the assistance of attendants, speaking occasionally to invisible companions, sometimes reciting scripture, sometimes sitting alone in rooms filled with memories he could no longer access. Outside the castle, life continued. The Prince Regent governed the country. Society moved forward with its grand events and political debates. The world entered a new age that no longer belonged to the king who had once shaped it. And inside Windsor, the old monarch drifted gently toward the final chapter of his life. It would come quietly, without ceremony, without the awareness that he had once ruled one of the most powerful empires on earth. Winter had settled over Windsor Castle in January of 1820. The corridors, once alive with the bustle of court life, were hushed. Attendants moved quietly, mindful of the fragile presence of the king who had long ceased to understand the world around him. George III lay in his bed, a man almost entirely separated from time, place, and memory. His body, once strong enough to lead armies and govern a vast empire, was now frail and bent. His long white beard had grown even longer, flowing over his chest, a pale echo of the regal image he once embodied. His eyes, clouded with cataracts for years, saw nothing. His ears, dulled by time and illness, heard only muffled echoes of the world beyond his walls. For 60 years he had ruled, shaped, and endured. He had witnessed revolutions, wars, and the rise and fall of empires. He had suffered personal losses that no monarch could easily bear. And yet now, in the quiet finality of his rooms, he seemed almost untethered from reality itself. Those who attended him watched for signs of recognition, for a flicker of awareness, for a breath of the man who had once been their king. But there were only gentle movements, shallow breaths, and the slow, inevitable cadence of life drawing to its close. At last, in the early hours of the morning on January 29, 1820, George III exhaled his final breath. He was 81 years old. The long shadow of his reign stretched across Britain. 60 years on the throne, the longest of any man in British history, had left a mark on the nation, on his family, and on history itself. Wars had been fought, colonies lost, and a world transformed. Yet in his last moments, there was no triumph, no audience, no fanfare. Only quiet. Only stillness. His son, the Prince Regent, now officially George IV, assumed the crown. But the transition was not accompanied by tears or mourning. The empire moved forward, indifferent to the passing of a man who had endured more than most could imagine. Inside Windsor, George III's life had ended as it had largely existed for his final years, quietly, removed from the world, surrounded by memory and shadow rather than power and presence. The king who had once been a beacon of discipline, duty, and moral integrity had passed into history, a man who had sought only to do what was right, and had been undone by forces both external and within himself. And as the doors of the castle closed on his life, the world continued, leaving behind only the story of a king who had lost not only his colonies, not only his authority, but ultimately himself. Even after George III's death, questions about his mind remained unanswered. For over a century, physicians, historians, and scholars have debated the nature of his illness, trying to understand what could have caused the terrifying swings of reason and madness that defined his later years. Some suggest porphyria, a rare genetic disease that affects the nervous system. Episodes of confusion, hallucinations, and physical weakness all match symptoms described in his medical records. The fact that some of his descendants showed similar signs lends weight to this theory. Others propose bipolar disorder, a condition characterized by extreme mood swings, periods of intense energy, and mania followed by deep depression. The unpredictability of his speech, his obsessive behavior, and the dramatic episodes of agitation align with modern descriptions of the illness. There are even theories of arsenic poisoning, possibly from the medicines and treatments used at court. Many 18th-century remedies contained arsenic, mercury, or other toxic substances, which could have worsened his mental and physical state. Or perhaps it was a combination of everything: a vulnerable mind, genetic predisposition, extreme stress from ruling an empire, the trauma of personal loss, and harsh medical interventions. The precise cause may never be known. What is clear, however, is not the diagnosis, but the tragedy of the man himself. George III was not a tyrant in the way history textbooks sometimes paint him. He was a man who tried to do right, to uphold duty, and to rule with integrity. He faced revolutions, lost an entire continent, and endured personal anguish beyond measure. Yet history remembered only the surface, the loss, the madness, the regency of his son. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth: a man who sought to serve his country faithfully, who ruled with ideals and devotion, ultimately became a shadow of himself, a king who outlived almost everyone he loved, blind, deaf, and lost within the walls of his own palace. His life stands as a somber meditation on power, responsibility, and the fragility of the human mind. A reminder that even those who seem most invincible can be quietly undone, and that history often tells the story of the world, not of the individuals who lived it. George III passed into legend not just as a monarch who lost America, but as a man who, in the end, lost himself. After the Regency was established in 1811, George III entered a world that existed almost entirely apart from reality. He was alive, yet the man who had once commanded empires, led armies, and shaped the destiny of nations had become a shadow moving through the corridors of Windsor Castle. For 10 long years he wandered the halls like a ghost. His sight had vanished completely, leaving him in darkness. His hearing was nearly gone, muffling the voices of those who cared for him. Days blurred into one another, marked only by the rituals of caretakers guiding him gently from room to room, helping him sit, eat, and walk. He spoke sometimes, but not always to anyone present. Words spilled out in bursts of memory and imagination. Occasionally he called for his children, long estranged or already distant, or quoted scripture aloud, the cadence of the verses grounding him in a world that had largely slipped away. Music remained a fragile tether to the past. At the pianoforte, his fingers would move over the keys, producing simple melodies. Sometimes he hummed along, as if recalling the life that had once been vibrant and ordered. These rare moments of lucidity were brief, fleeting islands of recognition in a vast sea of confusion. Yet even in his confusion, there were echoes of the man he had been. He could recognize familiar furniture, the contours of the rooms he had walked for decades. The palace staff knew these small recognitions were precious. They offered him comfort, a faint connection to the world he had once ruled. Outside Windsor, life went on without him. The Prince Regent governed, Britain continued its wars against Napoleon, and society thrived in the bright, extravagant age that would later bear his name. But inside the castle, time seemed suspended. The king's presence was more like a living memory than a functioning monarch. Visitors who saw him described a figure both tragic and haunting, a man clothed in simple garments, his long white beard flowing down his chest, moving slowly and deliberately, sometimes muttering to himself or gesturing at empty air. He was alive, but the vitality that once defined him had long vanished. And yet, for all his isolation, there were still small moments of human connection. Attendants would guide his hand to hold the pages of a Bible, help him touch the keys of the piano, or sit with him quietly in the drawing rooms. These moments offered brief flashes of comfort in a life that had become a long, slow descent into shadows. The man who had once sought to govern the world now existed only within a palace that had become both sanctuary and prison. 10 years of living death stretched ahead, each day repeating the last, a relentless meditation on loss, memory, and the fragility of the human mind. George III had become, in every sense, a living ghost of his former self. By 1818, George III's world had shrunk to the walls of Windsor Castle, and even those walls were no longer familiar to him in any meaningful way. The palace was filled with caretakers, physicians, and a few devoted attendants who guided him patiently through his daily routines, yet the king himself existed mostly in the space between memory and imagination. His body had grown frail. Long years of wandering the halls, of confinement, of failing health, had left him weak. He moved slowly, leaning on attendants for support, his long white beard brushing against his chest, his hands trembling as they clutched familiar furniture for guidance. The man who had once signed treaties, commanded armies, and presided over an empire was now dependent on others for every step, every meal, every action. Even the rhythm of time seemed distorted. Days blended into nights. Seasons passed like shadows at a distance. He no longer recognized the faces of those around him, not even his children. Voices sounded distant and strange, and most conversation fell into silence, leaving him to drift within the private corridors of his own mind. There were rare sparks, brief moments when something of the old king reappeared. At the piano, his fingers would wander over familiar keys, playing simple melodies from memory. Sometimes he recited long passages from the Bible with surprising clarity, as though the words themselves were anchors holding him to a world that had largely disappeared. These moments, however, were fleeting. Then, on November 17, 1818, Queen Charlotte passed away. For most people, this would have been a devastating loss. For George, the news barely reached him. He did not ask questions, did not respond with grief. The woman who had shared nearly 6 decades of life with him, who had given birth to 15 children and stood beside him through illness and political turmoil, no longer existed in his mind. She had already faded from his memory, leaving him alone in a world he could neither see nor hear clearly. The castle grew quieter still. George drifted through the familiar rooms, sometimes muttering to invisible companions, sometimes stopping to touch furniture or windows as if reconnecting with fragments of memory. Music, scripture, and ritual were the few threads keeping him tethered to reality. Outside, the world continued. The Prince Regent governed with extravagance and flair, Britain fought wars, and society thrived in the new Regency era. But within Windsor, George existed as a shadow of a man, a relic of a time long past. And then, slowly, the inevitable approached. Winter deepened. His frail body weakened further. Breath grew shallow. The once mighty king, who had endured illness, madness, and grief, was nearing the final act of a long, tragic life. He would not witness the world outside, nor the legacy he left behind. For George III, the last days were quiet, removed from recognition, removed from the triumphs and failures that had defined his long reign. The man who had once ruled an empire now waited, silently, for the final moment when history would reclaim him. On January 29, 1820, the long and tragic life of George III came to a quiet close within the walls of Windsor Castle. At 81 years old, he had lived longer and ruled longer than any man in British history, 60 years on the throne. But the final image of the king was far removed from the grandeur of his youth. He passed away quietly in his bed, surrounded by attendants who had guided him through the final years of blindness, deafness, and mental deterioration. There was no fanfare, no ceremonial farewell. The empire he had ruled so long continued its course without pause. His son, the Prince Regent, now George IV, assumed the crown, stepping into a world that had already moved on from the man he replaced. The tragedy of George III lies not only in the loss of America, not only in the political upheavals he endured, but in the slow erasure of the man himself. Once a young king filled with ideals and hope, he had endured relentless pressures, wars, revolutions, illness, and personal grief. By the end, he had outlived almost all those he loved, forgotten even the face of the woman who had shared his life for nearly 6 decades. Historians continue to debate his illness, porphyria, bipolar disorder, dementia, or a combination exacerbated by the harsh treatments of his time. But beyond the medical mystery, the true story is one of human fragility and resilience. George III was a king who tried to do right, who loved his family, and who devoted himself to duty, but even devotion could not shield him from the relentless forces of history, disease, and time. His life remains a meditation on the costs of power, the vulnerability of the human mind, and the tragedy of a man who, in the end, lost himself entirely. From the young king who married for love and ruled with conscientious care, to the blind, deaf, and isolated figure wandering the corridors of Windsor, George III's story is one of profound sorrow, human endurance, and the quiet heartbreak of a life lived under the shadow of both empire and illness. In the end, history remembered a king, but the man himself had already slipped away, leaving only the echoes of a long and tumultuous reign, a reminder that even the greatest power cannot guard the heart and mind from the ravages of time.